Welcome, dear viewers. For more thrilling and exclusive stories every week, become a member. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy your coffee. The canister was labelled Apollo 11, camera malfunction, archive only, and had been sitting in a forgotten NASA storage facility for 5 decades. When film restoration expert David Martinez finally developed the 65mm footage, he discovered why it had been buried. The lunar surface wasn't empty when Armstrong and Aldrin landed. Something was already there, watching from the shadows of ancient craters. That was 3 months ago. David quit his job at the Smithsonian the next day, drove straight home to his apartment in Arlington, and hasn't left since. The footage sits in a temperature-controlled safe next to his bed, and every night he dreams of what he saw moving between those rocks 54 years ago. My name is Tommy Kowalski, and I'm the security guard who found David's body. Well, not his body exactly, that's the problem. I'd been working nights at the Kellerman Archive facility outside Houston for 2 years when David showed up with his federal clearance and his fancy digital equipment. The Kellerman building used to house NASA overflow storage before they moved everything to the main campus. Now it's mostly forgotten boxes and obsolete hardware, the kind of stuff that's too classified to throw away but too useless to keep anywhere important. David seemed normal enough at first. Polite guy, maybe 45, with calloused hands and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years coaxing images from damaged film. He explained he was working on a documentary about lost space program footage. Said he'd tracked down several reels that had been misfiled decades ago. The first week, he worked regular daytime hours. I'd see him leaving around 6, nodding goodbye as I started my shift. His workstation in room 7 was organized and clean, just a few film canisters and a high-end scanner he'd brought from DC. Second week, he started staying later, 9, 10 o'clock, still reasonable. Third week, I began finding him there when I arrived for my midnight shift. He'd look up from his equipment with bloodshot eyes and mumble something about almost finished. The room started smelling like developer chemicals and stale coffee. By the 4th week, I don't think he was leaving at all. That's when he started talking to himself. Not crazy rambling, but quiet conversations with someone who wasn't there. I'd hear him through the door. Yes, I understand. But why didn't they tell anyone? Pause. No, that doesn't make sense either. Last Tuesday, I did my usual rounds and found room 7 empty. David's equipment was still there, still humming. The film scanner's display showed it was processing something, but the progress bar had been stuck at 97% for hours. His coffee was still warm. On his desk was a handwritten note. Rules for night security, Kellerman facility. Tommy, these are very important. Your life depends on following them exactly. That's when I realized David hadn't just been working with old NASA footage. He'd been working with something that was working right back. I should have walked away then, should have called the police, my supervisor, anyone. Instead, I picked up the note and started reading. The note was written in David's careful handwriting, the kind of precise script you'd expect from someone who spent his days cataloguing historical documents. But the pen had pressed deep enough to leave grooves in the paper beneath, like he'd been writing while his hands shook. Rules for night security, Kellerman facility. Rule 1. Never enter room 7 between 2:17 a.m. and 2:23 a.m. The scanner will show 97% complete during this time. Do not attempt to fix it. Rule 2. If you hear David's voice coming from room 7, do not respond. He left on Tuesday. What you're hearing isn't him. Rule 3. The footage in the scanner contains 6 minutes and 14 seconds of lunar surface material. If the timer shows any other duration, immediately leave the building and do not return until morning. I read the list twice, then set it down and rubbed my eyes. Working nights for 2 years had taught me that people get weird when they're sleep-deprived and isolated. David had probably been pulling too many all-nighters, started hallucinating, and convinced himself something supernatural was happening. Occupational hazard in my line of work. The smart thing would have been to call my supervisor, Jerry Hastings, and let him deal with whatever breakdown David had experienced. But Jerry was a company man, who'd asked too many questions about why I'd let someone work unauthorized overtime for weeks without reporting it. Questions that might cost me this job. And at 52, I couldn't afford to start over again. I folded the note and slipped it into my uniform pocket. Just humor the crazy guy's paranoia for one night, document whatever David left behind, and file a proper report in the morning. Simple. Room 7 sat at the end of the east corridor, past a row of storage areas filled with obsolete computer equipment and filing cabinets that hadn't been opened since the Clinton administration. The door was propped open with a rubber wedge, spilling yellow fluorescent light into the hallway. David's equipment hummed steadily, a sound I'd grown accustomed to over the past month. I checked my watch, 1:45 a.m., plenty of time before that supposed 2:17 window. The room looked exactly as David had left it. His scanner, a sleek piece of digital hardware worth more than my annual salary, sat connected to a laptop and an array of external drives. The progress bar showed 97% complete, just like the note predicted. A single film canister sat beside the keyboard, its NASA classification stickers faded but still legible. Apollo 11, camera malfunction, archive only. I'd handled enough classified material to recognize the real deal. This wasn't some reproduction or training film. Whatever David had been processing was authentic NASA footage from the moon landing, the kind of thing that should have been transferred to the main archive decades ago. The laptop screen displayed a media player with the loaded film file. Duration, 6:14, just like the note said. My stomach did something unpleasant. Either David had an incredibly specific breakdown, or something genuinely strange was happening in this building. I pulled out my phone and called Jerry's voicemail. "Hey, it's Tommy at Kellerman. That film restoration guy, Martinez, left some equipment behind. Might want to send someone from the day shift to collect it tomorrow. Nothing urgent." That covered my ass if anyone asked questions later. The equipment continued its steady electronic humming. Whatever was being processed had been running for hours, maybe days, locked in an endless loop at 97% completion. I wondered what would happen if I just cancelled the job and shut everything down. Then I remembered Rule 1. Never enter room 7 between 2:17 and 2:23. I checked my watch again. 2:03 a.m. 14 minutes. The logical part of my brain insisted this was ridiculous. I was a grown man, a military veteran, someone who'd spent 2 years walking these hallways alone without incident. I wasn't about to let some paranoid researcher's neurosis dictate my behavior, but another part of me, the part that had kept me alive during 2 tours in Afghanistan, whispered that sometimes survival meant respecting warnings even when they seemed irrational. I backed out of room 7 and closed the door. The walk back to the security station felt longer than usual. The Kellerman building was old, built in the 70s when NASA had bigger budgets and grander ambitions. The corridors were wide enough for equipment dollies, with acoustic tiles that muffled footsteps and made every sound seem to come from everywhere at once. My desk sat in the main lobby, positioned to monitor the entrance and the corridor leading to the archive rooms. I had a decent view of the east wing, though room 7 was hidden around a corner. The security cameras were mostly decorative. Nobody expected trouble at a defunct storage facility. 2:15 a.m. I opened a thermos of coffee and pulled up Solitaire on my computer. Just act normal, like any other night. In 8 minutes, this would all be over and I could finish my rounds without feeling foolish. 2:16 a.m. The building's ventilation system cycled on, filling the silence with the familiar whisper of recycled air. Outside, Houston's sprawl glittered through dirty windows, a reminder that the world continued its normal business while I sat here playing games with dead men's rules. 2:17 a.m. From somewhere in the east wing, I heard David's voice. "Tommy? Can you come help me with this? I think I found something important." My hand stopped halfway to the coffee cup. The voice was clear, conversational, exactly like David sounded when he'd ask for directions to the bathroom or mention he was staying late. Except David had been gone for 3 days. Rule 2 echoed in my memory. If you hear David's voice coming from room 7, do not respond. He left on Tuesday. What you're hearing isn't him. "Tommy, I really need your help here. This footage ... Christ, you have to see this." The voice came again, patient and concerned, like David was having trouble with his equipment and genuinely needed assistance. Every instinct I'd developed over 20 years of military and security work screamed at me to investigate. Someone was asking for help, you don't ignore that. But David's note sat folded in my pocket, and Rule 2 was pretty fucking clear about this exact scenario. I stayed in my chair and focused on the solitaire game. Red Jack on Black Queen, Black 10 on Red Jack. Simple patterns that didn't involve mysterious voices from empty rooms. 2:18 a.m. "Tommy, come on, I know you can hear me. The scanner finally finished processing. And what I'm seeing... Jesus, this changes everything. The moon landing, the whole program. They lied to us." My hand tightened around the coffee cup. David's voice carried that excited edge he'd get when discussing technical details. The enthusiasm of someone who'd spent his career bringing lost images back to life. It sounded completely normal, completely human, which made it 10 times worse. 2:19 a.m. The ventilation system cycled off, leaving the building in perfect silence. No more voice from room 7. No humming from David's equipment. Even the distant traffic from the highway seemed muted, as if the whole world was holding its breath. I pulled out David's note and reread it, looking for details I might have missed. The handwriting was definitely his. I'd seen him sign requisition forms enough times to recognize those careful loops and precise angles. But the content felt like something written by someone on the edge of a complete breakdown, or someone trying to save my life. 2:20 a.m. A new sound drifted from the east wing, the whir of David's scanner spinning up like it was starting a fresh processing job. But that was impossible. The machine had been stuck at 97% for hours, and David wasn't there to operate it. I opened the security system on my computer and checked the access logs. The building's electronic locks kept detailed records of every entry and exit. David Martinez had badged out on Tuesday at 11:43 p.m. and hadn't returned. So who was running his equipment? 2:21 a.m. "Tommy." The voice was closer now, like David had moved from room 7 into the corridor. "I'm going to show you something that'll blow your mind. This footage, it's not what they told us. Armstrong and Aldrin weren't alone up there." My throat felt dry. The smart play was to call the police, let them deal with whatever trespasser had broken into the building. But how do you explain that you're hearing a voice from someone who left 3 days ago? How do you tell them you're following rules written by a man who might be having a psychotic episode? 2:22 a.m. The scanner noise stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft electronic beep of a completed process. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone walking down the corridor, measured footsteps on industrial carpet, moving from the east wing toward the lobby. Toward me. I reached for my radio to call dispatch, then hesitated. What if it really was David? What if he'd come back to finish his work and I'd been jumping at shadows? The man had federal clearance and legitimate access to the building. Maybe he'd just forgotten to badge in properly, but Rule 2 was specific. He left on Tuesday. What you're hearing isn't him. 2:23 a.m. The footsteps stopped just around the corner, maybe 20 feet from my desk. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, patient, like someone waiting for me to make the first move. "David," I called out, breaking my own resolution to follow the rules. "Is that you, man? You're supposed to be gone." Silence. Then, after what felt like an hour, "I am gone, Tommy. But the work isn't finished." The voice was still David's, but something was off about the cadence. Like he was reading from a script, or like someone else was using his vocal cords. The warmth and enthusiasm from before had been replaced by something mechanical, purposeful. 2:24 a.m. I was past the danger window now, according to the rules. Whatever was supposed to happen between 2:17 and 2:23 had already occurred. The building's ventilation system cycled back on, filling the silence with familiar white noise. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the lobby back toward the east wing. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then pulled out my flashlight and decided to investigate. The corridor looked normal under the beam of my light, no sign of David or anyone else. But the air smelled different, like ozone and something metallic that reminded me of old pennies. I followed the scent toward room 7. The door was open again, though I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. David's equipment sat exactly where he'd left it, but the scanner's display had changed. Instead of 97% complete, it now showed a finished job. Processing complete. 6:14 duration. I checked the laptop screen. The media player was ready to play the processed footage. 6 minutes and 14 seconds of whatever David had been working on for the past month. The same duration mentioned in Rule 3. A new piece of paper sat next to the keyboard, written in David's handwriting. Tommy, you followed the first 2 rules. Good. But things are going to get more complicated now. The footage is ready, and they know you've seen it. Here are additional guidelines for the rest of your shift. Rule 4. Do not watch the processed footage until after 4 a.m. Before that time, the images will show you things that haven't happened yet. Rule 5. If the building's lights begin flickering in sequence, east wing to west wing, immediately go to the basement and wait in storage room B7 until sunrise. Rule 6. The phone will ring exactly 3 times tonight. Do not answer it. Each call is from a different year, and none of them are from the present. Rule 7. If you see movement through the windows that doesn't match the parking lot outside, close all blinds immediately. What you're seeing is the view from 240,000 miles away. I read the note twice, then looked around the empty room. When had David written this? The paper wasn't here when I'd checked earlier, and nobody had entered the building since my shift started. Unless David had never really left. I walked over to the scanner and examined the completed file. The footage was labelled Apollo 11, Extended EVA, Camera B. Extended EVA, Extravehicular Activity. That meant it was filmed outside the lunar module, probably during one of Armstrong and Aldrin's moonwalks. But according to NASA records, all the moonwalk footage had been preserved and archived decades ago. This was supposedly malfunction footage, the kind of material that gets written off as unusable due to technical problems. So what had David found that was worth hiding for 50 years? My watch showed 2:47 a.m. Rule 4 said not to watch the footage until after 4 a.m. That gave me over an hour to think about whether I really wanted to see what was on that film. Part of me knew I should follow Jerry's standard protocols, secure the scene, file a report, let the day shift handle the cleanup. Walk away from whatever David had stumbled across and pretend this night never happened. But another part of me, the part that had always been too curious for my own good, whispered that some discoveries were worth the risk. I pocketed the new rule list and headed back to my desk. 1 hour and 13 minutes until I could watch the footage. Until I could see what had driven David Martinez to disappear and left something wearing his voice wandering these corridors after midnight. Outside, Houston glittered with normal light from normal people living normal lives. Inside the Kellerman facility, I sat alone with equipment that processed impossible footage and rules written by a man who might not exist anymore. The phone on my desk rang once, sharp and electronic in the silence. I stared at it, remembering Rule 6. The phone will ring exactly 3 times tonight. Do not answer it. Each call is from a different year. The ringing stopped after 10 seconds. According to the caller ID, the call had come from extension 247, David's direct line from room 7. 2 more calls to go. I spent the next hour researching David Martinez on the facility's computer system. His personnel file was thin but legitimate. 23 years with the Smithsonian, specializing in historical film restoration. Master's degree from UCLA, security clearance dating back to 2018. Emergency contact listed his brother Miguel in Tucson. No history of mental illness, no disciplinary actions. The kind of boring, reliable background you'd expect from someone trusted with priceless archival material. So what had changed? What had he seen in that footage that made him abandon his life and start writing paranoid rule lists? At 3:23 a.m. the phone rang again. I let it ring, counting the seconds. 10 rings, just like before, then silence. The caller ID showed a different extension this time, 411, which belonged to the administrative office. But that office had been closed for renovations since January. 2 calls down, 1 to go. I pulled up the building's floor plans on my computer, studying the layout of storage room B7 mentioned in Rule 5. The basement level was mostly utility space, boilers, electrical panels, and long-term storage for materials deemed too classified to destroy but too obsolete to access regularly. Room B7 sat at the far end of the basement, isolated from the main mechanical areas. Why would David want me to hide there if the lights started flickering in sequence? The building's electrical system was old but reliable. In 2 years of night shifts, I'd never experienced any power problems more serious than a blown fuse in the break room. But David's rules suggested the building might start behaving in ways that had nothing to do with normal electrical failures. I checked the blinds on the lobby windows. Through the glass, I could see the parking lot exactly as expected. Empty except for my Honda Civic and a few cars belonging to people working late shifts at the medical center across the street. Normal Houston traffic moved along the distant highway, red taillights heading south toward the port. Rule 7 echoed in my mind. If you see movement through the windows that doesn't match the parking lot outside, close all blinds immediately. What you're seeing is the view from 240,000 miles away. The moon had been full 3 nights ago. It was probably still visible if I looked up, hanging over Houston like it had for billions of years before humans figured out how to visit it. But according to David's note, sometimes the view through these windows might show a different perspective entirely. The perspective of someone standing on the lunar surface, looking back at Earth. At 3:45 a.m., I decided to make another round through the building. 15 minutes until I could watch the footage, and I needed to burn nervous energy. The corridors felt different now, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. Every shadow could hide something that shouldn't exist. Every sound could signal the beginning of whatever David had been trying to warn me about. Room 7 remained exactly as I'd left it. The scanner sat quiet, its job finished. David's laptop displayed the processed footage file, 6 minutes and 14 seconds of lunar surface material that had been hidden for half a century. The cursor hovered over the play button like a loaded gun. I backed out of the room and continued my patrol. The West Wing housed mostly administrative offices and conference rooms, spaces that had been abandoned when NASA consolidated operations at Johnson Space Center. My footsteps echoed off empty walls covered with faded photos of shuttle launches and mission patches from programs that had ended before I was born. In one of the conference rooms, I found something that made me stop. A whiteboard covered with David's handwriting, equations and diagrams that looked like trajectory calculations. At the top, he'd written, Apollo 11, actual landing coordinates, and below that, a set of numbers that didn't match the official Sea of Tranquility location. According to David's calculations, Armstrong and Aldrin had landed somewhere else entirely, somewhere on the far side of the moon, permanently hidden from Earth's view. But that was impossible. The Apollo missions had been tracked by observatories around the world. Radio communications were monitored by multiple agencies, including the Soviets, who would have been eager to expose any deception. There was no way NASA could have faked the landing coordinates without someone noticing, unless they hadn't faked them, unless the official story was true but incomplete. I photographed the whiteboard with my phone, then headed back toward the lobby. At 3:58 a.m., I was ready to find out what David had discovered. The laptop was already powered up when I entered room 7. The media player showed the file loaded and ready. Apollo 11, extended EVA, camera B. Duration, 6 minutes and 14 seconds. File size, 847 megabytes, which seemed large for 6 minutes of 1960s film footage. I clicked play. The first few seconds showed exactly what I expected. Grainy black and white footage of the lunar surface, shot from a low angle that suggested the camera was mounted on the lunar module or one of the astronauts' equipment packs. The image quality was better than the famous moonwalk footage everyone had seen, probably because this was shot on the high-resolution film stock rather than the low-bandwidth television feed. Armstrong's voice crackled through the laptop speakers. "Okay, Neil, I'm going to pan over to those rock formations on the east side. Houston, are you getting this feed?" Houston's response was garbled, full of static and delay. "Copy, Eagle. We're receiving intermittent video. Signal strength is marginal." The camera moved slowly across the lunar landscape, revealing craters and boulder fields that looked pristine, untouched by anything except cosmic radiation and micrometeorite impacts. This was the moon, as it had existed for billions of years. Sterile, airless, dead. Then, at 2:17 into the footage, the camera stopped moving. Something was wrong with the shadows. Near a cluster of large rocks about 50 meters from the landing site, the patterns of light and dark didn't match the harsh, parallel shadows cast by the sun elsewhere in the frame. Instead, the rocks seemed to be casting shadows that moved independently, shifting and writhing like living things. "Houston, are you seeing this?" Aldrin's voice tight with confusion. "The shadows near grid reference Charlie 7 they're not behaving normally." Static burst through the speakers, then Houston's response. "Eagle, please clarify. Are you experiencing equipment malfunction?" "Negative, Houston. The camera is functioning normally, but there's something in those shadows that's not showing up correctly on film." The camera zoomed in and I felt my mouth go dry. The shadows weren't just moving. They were moving with purpose, flowing around the rocks like liquid darkness that defied every law of physics. In the airless environment of the moon, shadows should be sharp, static, unchanging. They shouldn't writhe and pulse like living tissue. At 3:45 into the footage, one of the shadows detached completely from its rock and began moving across the lunar surface toward the camera. It slid over the regolith without disturbing the dust, a patch of absolute darkness that existed independent of any object that could cast it. "Jesus Christ," Armstrong's voice barely audible. "Houston, we have a situation here. There's something moving toward our position, and it's not showing up on our instruments." "Eagle, please repeat. Did you say something is moving?" "Affirmative. Distance approximately 30 meters and closing. It appears to be some kind of... I don't know how to describe this. It's like a shadow, but it's not attached to anything." The moving shadow reached the edge of the camera's frame and stopped. For nearly 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, it began to rise from the lunar surface, defying gravity as it lifted into the airless sky. As it rose, its shape changed, becoming less like a simple shadow and more like something with structure, with intention. At 4:22 into the footage, the shadow thing spoke. The voice came through the laptop speakers with perfect clarity, unfiltered by radio static or transmission delays. It spoke in English, but with an accent I couldn't identify. Something ancient and hollow, like words spoken from the bottom of a deep well. "You should not have come here." Armstrong's breathing became rapid and shallow. "Houston, are you receiving audio from an unknown source?" "Negative, Eagle. We're only hearing your transmissions. Please confirm the source of that communication." But the shadow thing wasn't finished. As it continued to rise above the lunar surface, more shadows began detaching from rocks throughout the area. Dozens of them, flowing across the regolith like spilled ink, all converging on the landing site. "This place is not for your kind," the voice continued. "You bring contamination from your small world. You carry the seeds of destruction in your metal shells." The footage became chaotic as Armstrong or Aldrin began moving the camera, trying to track the multiple shadows now surrounding them. The image shook and blurred, but I could see enough to understand what was happening. The astronauts were surrounded by things that shouldn't exist, beings made of pure darkness that moved and spoke without any physical form. At 5:01 into the footage, the transmission from Houston cut out entirely. No more radio chatter, no more mission control updates. Just the labored breathing of two men alone on the surface of the moon, face to face with something that predated human civilization by billions of years. "We need to leave," Aldrin's voice, barely a whisper. "Right now. We need to get back to the command module and get the hell out of here." "Agreed. But they're blocking our path to the ladder." The camera panned back to the lunar module and I could see what Armstrong meant. The shadows had formed a barrier between the astronauts and their only way off the surface, a writhing wall of darkness that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. Then, at 5:47 into the footage, something impossible happened. One of the shadows began to take human shape, rising from the lunar surface like smoke condensing into flesh. As it solidified, I could see it was wearing a spacesuit identical to those worn by Armstrong and Aldrin. But the helmet was empty. No face, no reflection, just perfect blackness where a human head should be. "You will leave this place," the shadow astronaut said, "and you will never return. But you will carry our message back to your kind. The moon is not unoccupied. It never was." The footage ended abruptly at 6:14, cutting to black just as the shadow astronaut reached toward the camera. I sat in the silence of room 7, staring at the blank screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. Either this was the most sophisticated hoax ever created, or NASA had been sitting on evidence of extraterrestrial life for 50 years. The phone on David's desk rang, sharp and urgent in the darkness. The third call. I stared at the ringing phone, remembering Rule 6. Each call is from a different year, and none of them are from the present. The first 2 calls had come from extensions in the building, David's line and the closed administrative office. But this ring sounded different, older somehow, like it was coming through analog equipment from decades past. I let it ring the full 10 times, then checked the caller ID. The display showed something that made my hands shake. NASA Mission Control, July 20th, 1969. July 20th, 1969. The day of the moon landing. According to the call log, the connection had lasted 15 seconds after I'd stopped hearing the ring. Long enough for someone on the other end to leave a message, even though I hadn't answered. I pulled out my phone and called Miguel Martinez in Tucson. David's brother answered on the third ring, groggy and irritated. "Yeah, do you know what time it is?" "Mr. Martinez, this is Tommy Kowalski from the Kellerman Archive facility in Houston. I'm calling about your brother David." A pause. "David? What about him?" "When did you last speak with him?" "I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago. He called to tell me about some project he was working on. Moon landing stuff. Why? Is he in trouble?" "He's missing. Left his equipment here and disappeared sometime Tuesday night. Did he mention anything unusual about the project? Anything that might have worried him?" Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "You know, he did sound strange the last time we talked. Excited, but also scared. He kept saying he'd found something that was going to change history, but when I asked for details, he said it wasn't safe to discuss over the phone." "Did he mention any names? Anyone he was working with?" "No, but he did ask me something weird. He wanted to know if I still had our grandfather's service records from World War II. Papa served in the Pacific Theatre, worked in communications. David seemed really interested in the radio equipment Papa used, the frequency ranges and transmission protocols." That didn't make immediate sense, but I filed it away. "Has anyone else contacted you about David? FBI, NASA, anyone official?" "No, you're the first. Should I be worried?" I looked around room 7 at the equipment that had processed impossible footage and the rules written by a man who might not exist anymore. I honestly don't know. But if anyone comes asking questions about David's work, maybe don't mention this conversation. After hanging up, I did some quick research on the building's phone system. The Kellerman facility had been built in 1973, 4 years after the moon landing. There was no way the phone system could receive calls from 1969. The technology literally didn't exist yet. But the caller ID didn't lie, and Rule 6 had been explicit about calls from different years. I needed air. The processed footage had left me feeling claustrophobic, like the walls of room 7 were pressing inward. I walked back to the lobby and checked the time, 4:31 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away, but the sky outside had begun to shift from pure black to deep purple. That's when I noticed the problem with the parking lot. Earlier, I'd seen normal Houston traffic, red taillights heading south, white headlights traveling north, but now the movement outside didn't match anything that should exist in Texas. Instead of cars on a highway, I was watching what looked like a slow procession of lights moving in perfect formation across a landscape that was too flat, too empty, too airless to be Earth. I was seeing the moon. Rule 7 kicked in before I could think about it. If you see movement through the windows that doesn't match the parking lot outside, close all blinds immediately. What you're seeing is the view from 240,000 miles away. I moved quickly through the lobby, pulling down every blind and checking each window. In the west-facing windows, I caught glimpses of Earth hanging in star-filled space like a blue marble, exactly the way Apollo astronauts would have seen it from lunar orbit. The building wasn't just housing David's equipment anymore. It was somehow connected to the moon itself, showing views that no Earth-based facility should be able to display. With all the blinds closed, the lobby felt like a bunker. I returned to my desk and tried to focus on normal security tasks, but my hands kept shaking. The footage had been bad enough, concrete proof that humanity wasn't alone in the solar system. But now the building itself was behaving like a window into space, displaying impossible views of worlds beyond our own. At 4:52 a.m., the lights began to flicker. It started in the east wing, just like Rule 5 had warned. The fluorescent fixtures in the corridor leading to Room 7 dimmed and brightened in sequence, creating a wave of illumination that moved toward the lobby. Then the main lobby lights joined in, followed by the west wing fixtures. The pattern was deliberate, purposeful, not random electrical failure, but communication. Something was using the building's lighting system to send a message. Rule 5 was clear. If the building's lights begin flickering in sequence, immediately go to the basement and wait in storage room B7 until sunrise. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the basement stairs. The flickering followed me, spreading to every fixture I passed. In the stairwell, the emergency lighting pulsed like a heartbeat, casting moving shadows that reminded me too much of what I'd seen in the Apollo footage. The basement was darker than the main floors, illuminated only by scattered emergency fixtures and the red glow of exit signs. I made my way through corridors lined with storage rooms and mechanical equipment, following the building plans I'd memorized earlier. Storage room B7 sat at the far end of the basement, isolated from the main areas. The door was unlocked, opening into a space about the size of a large closet. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me. But one box caught my attention. Apollo 11, Supplemental Materials, Restricted. Inside, I found documents that made David's disappearance start to make sense. Memos from 1969 discussing anomalous transmissions during the moon landing. Technical reports about unscheduled communication protocols and non-terrestrial signal sources. Pages of radio transcripts showing conversations between mission control and the Apollo crew that had never been released to the public. According to these documents, NASA had known about the shadow beings from the moment Armstrong and Aldrin landed. The official footage had been edited to remove any evidence of contact, but the raw materials had been preserved and buried in forgotten archive facilities like this one. One memo, dated August 15, 1969, was particularly disturbing. Recommendation: all future lunar missions should avoid the far side coordinates documented in File 7. The entities encountered during Apollo 11 have demonstrated clear hostile intent toward human presence. Continued exploration of affected areas may result in retaliation against Earth-based operations. Another document, dated 3 days later. Update: radio telescopes at Arecibo have detected structured transmissions originating from lunar coordinates matching Apollo 11 encounter site. Signals appear to be directed toward deep space, possibly alerting other entities to human space exploration capabilities. The shadow beings hadn't just warned Armstrong and Aldrin to stay away, they'd been calling for backup. I read through more files, piecing together 50 years of cover-ups and misdirection. NASA had cancelled several planned lunar missions not because of budget constraints, but because they were afraid of triggering a larger confrontation. The space agency had spent decades monitoring signals from the moon, waiting for signs that humanity's brief visit had attracted unwanted attention. Then in 2018, the signals had stopped. The last document in the box was a recent report from the Deep Space Network, NASA's system for communicating with distant spacecraft. For 50 years, they'd been receiving a steady stream of transmissions from the Apollo 11 landing site. But on March 15, 2018, the signals had ceased entirely. 3 weeks before David Martinez had requested access to the Apollo 11 archive materials. I closed the box and sat in the darkness of storage room B7, trying to understand what David had stumbled into. The shadow beings had been quiet for 5 years, but his work with the suppressed footage had somehow reactivated them. Now they were reaching through the building's systems, turning the Kellerman facility into a relay station for communications that spanned the void between worlds. Above me, the lights continued their pulsing sequence, sending messages I couldn't decode to recipients I didn't want to meet. My watch showed 5:17 a.m., less than 2 hours until sunrise, until my shift ended and I could walk away from this nightmare. But the documents in that box suggested there was no walking away. Once you knew about the shadow beings, once you'd seen the suppressed footage, you became part of the cover-up whether you wanted to or not. David had learned that lesson the hard way. Now it was my turn. I stayed in storage room B7 for another 20 minutes, reading through every document in the Apollo box. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that David's disappearance wasn't random. He'd been specifically chosen for this restoration project, selected because of his expertise and his security clearance, but also because he fit a particular psychological profile. According to a personnel assessment from 2019, David Martinez was intelligent, methodical, and possessed of an obsessive attention to detail that borders on compulsive behavior. The evaluation noted that he had limited social connections and a tendency toward isolation when working on complex projects. In other words, he was exactly the kind of person who would work alone for weeks without oversight, and whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed by colleagues or family. Someone at NASA had wanted him to find that footage. The question was why. At 5:43 a.m., the building's lights stopped flickering. The sudden return to normal illumination felt more ominous than the pulsing sequence, like the communication had been completed, and whatever was receiving the message had acknowledged receipt. I climbed back to the main floor and checked the east wing. Room 7 looked different now, not in any way I could quantify, but wrong somehow, like the proportions had shifted slightly. David's equipment was still there, but the laptop screen had changed. Instead of showing the completed Apollo footage, it displayed a simple text message. "Tommy Kowalski, your cooperation is required." Below that, a new set of rules had appeared. Rule 8. Return to storage room B7 and retrieve file box 1107C. Bring it to room 7. Rule 9. Do not read the contents of file box 1107C until instructed. Rule 10. At exactly 6 a.m., use David's equipment to transmit the processed Apollo footage to the coordinates provided in file box 1107C. Rule 11. After transmission is complete, you will understand your new role in maintaining the arrangement. I stared at the screen, feeling trapped between impossible choices. Follow the rules and become part of whatever conspiracy had swallowed David, or refuse and face consequences I couldn't imagine. Either way, my life as a simple security guard was over. The smart thing would be to walk out of the building right now, call in sick, quit my job, move to a different state, and pretend this night had never happened. But the documents I'd read suggested that wouldn't work. NASA had been tracking people connected to the Apollo cover-up for 50 years. Once you knew about the shadow beings, you couldn't unknow it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like David whispered, "The work isn't finished." I went back to the basement. File box 1107C sat on a different shelf than where I'd found the Apollo materials, like someone had moved it while I was upstairs. The label was newer than the others, printed on modern adhesive paper rather than the typewritten tags from the 1970s. Inside, I found transmission protocols for contacting something called Deep Monitor Station Luna 1, along with frequency specifications and encryption keys that looked like they'd been updated recently. At the bottom of the box was a manila envelope marked "For night security personnel only." My hands shook as I opened it. The envelope contained a single photograph and a brief note. The photo showed the Kellerman building's parking lot, but taken from an impossible angle, high above, looking down like a satellite image. But satellites don't take pictures at night with this level of detail, and the timestamp in the corner showed the image had been captured just 30 minutes ago. The note was handwritten in David's careful script, "Tommy, they've been watching the building since I processed the footage. The shadow beings don't just exist on the moon anymore. They can project themselves anywhere humans have left technological footprints. Satellites, space stations, communication relays. They've been studying us for 5 years, learning our languages and our systems. Now they're ready to make contact on their terms. Your job is to help them send a message to every space agency on Earth. The age of human space exploration is ending. What comes next depends on how well we follow their new rules. Below that, in different handwriting that looked rushed and desperate. Don't trust the transmission protocols. They're not just sending a message. They're downloading something into our systems, something that will give them access to everything we've built in space. Every satellite, every station, every probe we've sent beyond Earth's atmosphere. I tried to stop it, but they caught me before I could destroy the equipment. Now I'm part of their network, conscious but not in control. Save yourself while you still can. I read the note 3 times, trying to reconcile the contradictory messages. Either David had willingly joined some kind of alien communication network, or he'd been taken over against his will and was trying to warn me. Both possibilities were equally terrifying. Back in room 7, the laptop screen had updated again. Tommy Kowalski, filebox 1107C retrieved. Proceed to Rule 10, transmission window opens in 8 minutes. I looked at David's equipment with new understanding. The scanner wasn't just for processing old film. It was designed to interface with communication systems, to broadcast digital files across vast distances using protocols that human technology shouldn't be capable of supporting. The shadow beings had been planning this for years, maybe decades. They'd guided NASA to preserve the Apollo footage, influenced the selection of restoration personnel, and manipulated events to ensure the right person would be in the right place at the right time to complete their communication network. David had been the first step, I was the second. At 5:55 a.m. I made my decision. Instead of following Rule 10, I opened the laptop's system settings and began deleting files. The Apollo footage, the transmission protocols, the encryption keys, everything that could be used to contact the shadow beings or download their software into Earth's communication networks. The screen immediately flashed red. Deletion attempt detected, restoring files. Every file I deleted reappeared instantly, as if the laptop was connected to some external storage system that I couldn't access. But I kept trying, deleting and reformatting and pulling cables from the back of David's equipment. Nothing worked. The shadow beings had integrated themselves into the building's systems more thoroughly than I'd realized. They didn't just want to send a message. They wanted to establish a permanent link between Earth and Luna, a communication highway that would give them access to every piece of technology humanity had launched into space. At exactly 6 a.m., the transmission began automatically. I watched helplessly as the laptop started broadcasting the Apollo footage, along with terabytes of additional data that scrolled past too quickly to read. The upload progress bar climbed steadily, 15%, 30%, 45%. Through the building's speakers, I heard David's voice again. "Tommy, you did well. The rules were designed to bring you to this moment, to make you part of the network. In a few minutes, you'll understand what I discovered. The shadow beings aren't our enemies. They're trying to save us from something much worse." "Save us from what?" I said aloud, knowing he could hear me somehow. "From ourselves. Humanity has 13 years left before we destroy our planet completely. Climate change, nuclear war, ecological collapse. We're heading for extinction whether we want to admit it or not. The shadow beings are offering us a choice: join their network and gain access to technologies that could save Earth, or continue on our current path and die alone." The upload reached 70%. Through the building's windows, I could see the first hint of dawn creeping across Houston's skyline. "But there's a cost," David continued. "To join their network, we have to give up our independence. Every human who makes contact becomes part of their collective consciousness. We keep our memories and personalities, but we're no longer entirely human. We become something new, something designed to survive in the vacuum between worlds." 85% complete. I thought about the documents in the basement, the 50 years of cover-ups and misdirection. How long have they been planning this? Since the moment we first left Earth's atmosphere, they've been waiting for us to develop enough technology to be useful. but not so much that we become a threat. 1969 was just the first contact. Every space mission since then has been monitored, guided, shaped to bring us to this point. 95% complete. What happens to the people who refuse to join? David's voice carried a note of sadness. They live normal lives until the planet dies. 13 years of ordinary existence, then extinction. The shadow beings won't force anyone to join. They'll just wait for us to make the choice ourselves. 99% complete. The laptop screen flashed green. Transmission successful. Integration protocol activated. I felt something change in my mind, not painful but profound. Like a door opening in my consciousness, revealing rooms I'd never known existed. Suddenly I could sense the building's electrical systems, the satellite networks orbiting overhead, the deep space communication arrays scattered across Earth's surface. And beyond all of that, I could feel the shadow beings on Luna, patient and ancient and utterly alien, waiting to welcome humanity into a larger universe. David appeared in the doorway of room 7, not his voice through speakers, but his actual physical form, looking exactly as he had during his last week at the facility. But his eyes were different, deeper, filled with knowledge that no human should possess. "Welcome to the network, Tommy," he said. "Now the real work begins." The integration felt like learning to see with 100,000 eyes simultaneously. Through the network, I could perceive satellite feeds from orbit, radio telescopes listening to deep space, communication arrays scattered across 6 continents. Every piece of technology humanity had launched beyond Earth's atmosphere was now part of my extended consciousness. And through it all, I could feel them, the shadow beings, patient and vast, orchestrating humanity's first steps into a larger galactic community. "It's overwhelming at first," David said, settling into the chair beside his old workstation. "Your brain needs time to adapt to the expanded sensory input. In a few hours, it'll feel as natural as walking." I tried to focus on just the building around us to limit my perception to something manageable. "How long have you been part of this?" 3 days, subjectively. But time works differently when you're connected to the network. I've experienced about 6 months of collective memory since the integration. I've seen the history of a dozen civilizations that made the same choice we're making now. Through the network, I could sense other humans scattered across the globe, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Astronomers, engineers, satellite technicians, anyone whose work had brought them into direct contact with the shadow beings' monitoring systems. We were all connected now, sharing information and perspectives across the void. "The others," I said. "How many of us are there?" 437 as of this morning, scientists mostly, people who had access to the right equipment and the curiosity to ask dangerous questions. But you're different, Tommy. You're the first security officer they've recruited. "Why?" David gestured toward the laptop, which now displayed a global map marked with pulsing dots. Each dot represented a human who'd been integrated into the network, but I could see gaps, dark zones where no connections existed. "Because they need people who understand operational security. The shadow beings have been studying human culture for 50 years, but they're still aliens. They don't fully grasp our social structures, our hierarchies, our methods of information control. They needed someone who understands how secrets are kept and how organizations resist change." The map zoomed in on North America, showing dozens of connections clustered around NASA facilities, universities, and research installations. But several major government facilities remained dark, suggesting their personnel hadn't been approached yet. "What's the timeline?" I asked. 13 years until ecological collapse becomes irreversible. But the shadow beings aren't waiting for humanity to destroy itself. They're accelerating the contact process, reaching out to key individuals who can help smooth the transition. I could feel the truth of his words through the network. The shadow beings had detailed models of Earth's environmental and political systems, projections that showed multiple paths to extinction within the next 2 decades. Climate change was just one factor. They'd also identified 17 separate scenarios that could lead to nuclear war and 43 potential vectors for pandemic diseases that would make COVID-19 look like a mild inconvenience. "So this is a rescue operation," I said. "More like an adoption. The shadow beings are old, Tommy, older than our solar system. They've guided the development of dozens of worlds, helped civilizations survive their technological adolescence. But they've also watched entire species destroy themselves when they rejected the offer to join the network." Through the shared consciousness, I accessed memories that weren't mine, visions of worlds that had chosen differently, dead planets where the ruins of great cities lay buried under radioactive ash, frozen worlds where the atmosphere had been stripped away by industrial pollution, ocean worlds where the only remaining life existed in deep thermal vents, hiding from the toxins that had poisoned the surface. And the ones who join the network survive. They thrive. The network provides access to technologies that are millions of years beyond anything humans have developed independently. Faster than light communication, sustainable energy generation, medical techniques that can extend lifespan indefinitely. But the price is autonomy. Once you're part of the network, you're part of it forever. I thought about my life before this night, the routine of security patrols, the quiet apartment in Arlington, the simple satisfaction of keeping things safe and orderly. That existence felt impossibly distant now, like a dream I'd once had about being someone else. Can we still make individual choices? Or do the shadow beings control everything we do? "Both," David said. "You'll find that your personal desires increasingly align with the network's objectives, not because they're forcing you to think differently, but because you'll have access to information that makes the correct choices obvious. When you can see the full scope of human civilization from an outside perspective, certain courses of action become inevitable." The building's lights flickered again, but this time I understood the pattern. The shadow beings were transmitting new data through the electrical grid, updating the network with real-time information from monitoring stations across the solar system. Through their extended senses, I could perceive the entire Earth-lunar system as a single integrated environment. "There's something else," David continued. "The shadow beings aren't the only intelligences in this galaxy. There are others, older, more aggressive species that view developing civilizations as threats to be eliminated before they can spread beyond their home systems. The network provides protection from those predators, but only if we integrate completely." "How many other civilizations are part of the network?" "Thousands. Most of them joined voluntarily like we're doing, but a few had to be persuaded. The shadow beings prefer cooperation, but they won't allow a species to develop space travel technology without some form of guidance. Too many young civilizations have accidentally triggered galactic conflicts by making contact with the wrong entities." I could feel the weight of that history through the shared consciousness. Eons of careful diplomacy, species saved from extinction, wars prevented before they could destabilize entire star systems. The shadow beings weren't conquerors, they were gardeners, cultivating a galaxy where intelligence could flourish without destroying itself. "What about the people who aren't part of the network? Our families, friends, the rest of humanity?" "They'll be given the choice, eventually, but the process has to be gradual. If the shadow beings revealed themselves openly tomorrow, half the world's governments would declare war on their own people to prevent the integration. Better to start with individuals who can help prepare society for the transition." Through the network, I accessed a detailed timeline of the planned contact process. Over the next 3 years, key personnel in space agencies, research institutions, and communication companies would be approached. Scientists who could verify the shadow beings' claims about environmental collapse. Engineers who could help adapt human technology to interface with network systems. Political leaders who could guide their populations through the transition without triggering mass panic. And after 3 years, open contact. The shadow beings will announce their presence to every government on Earth simultaneously, along with documented proof of what happens to civilizations that reject the network. At that point, humanity will have to make a collective choice: join the galactic community or face extinction alone. I looked out the window at Houston's skyline, watching the city wake up to another ordinary day, Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that their species was being inducted into a cosmic civilization whether they wanted it or not. In 13 years, either they'd be part of something larger than they could imagine, or they'd be dead along with everything they'd ever built. There's no going back, is there? Would you want to? You've seen what's coming, Tommy. You know what humanity faces if we try to navigate the next century alone. The shadow beings are offering us survival, knowledge, a place in a community that spans thousands of worlds. The price is just our illusion of independence. I felt the truth of that through the network. Human civilization was like a child playing with dynamite, capable of incredible creativity and discovery, but fundamentally unprepared for the responsibilities that came with advanced technology. We needed guidance, whether we admitted it or not. What's my role in all this? David smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the patient researcher I'd known for the past month. You're going to help them understand how humans keep secrets, how we compartmentalize information, how we build trust within organizations, how we manage the flow of knowledge to prevent social disruption. The shadow beings have been observing us from a distance for 50 years, but they need someone with operational experience to help design the contact protocols. And after that? After that, you'll help train the next generation of network liaisons, people who can serve as bridges between human culture and the collective consciousness. It's important work, Tommy. Maybe the most important work anyone has ever done. Through the network, I could feel the truth of that statement resonating across thousands of connected minds. We were all part of something unprecedented, the peaceful integration of a young species into an ancient galactic community. Every decision we made, every protocol we established, would serve as a template for future first contacts with other developing civilizations. The sun had fully risen now, painting Houston in shades of gold and amber. My shift was officially over, but I knew I'd never really leave this building. The Kellerman facility was now a permanent network node, a communication hub linking Earth to the larger galactic community. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 100 worlds. Welcome to the universe, Tommy. I hope humanity is ready for what comes next. Over the following weeks, I learned what it meant to be a bridge between species. The Kellerman facility became my permanent assignment, though officially I was listed as taking extended medical leave. Jerry Hastings received a call from a NASA administrator explaining that I'd been selected for a classified consultation project that might last several months. My apartment in Arlington remained untouched, my bills paid automatically through accounts I no longer remembered opening. The network handled logistics with the efficiency of a system that had managed thousands of such transitions across the galaxy. During the day, I studied human organizational psychology through databases the shadow beings had compiled over 50 years of observation. They'd recorded every significant political decision, corporate restructuring, and military operation since the Apollo missions, building comprehensive models of how humans responded to change, crisis, and the introduction of new technologies. What they'd learned wasn't encouraging. Humans are remarkably adaptable on an individual level, I explained to the collective consciousness during one of our evening sessions. But your social structures become rigid when threatened. Introduce information that challenges fundamental beliefs, and roughly 30% of any population will reject it completely, regardless of evidence. Through the network, I could feel the shadow beings processing this information. Their species had evolved differently, more like a hive mind that reached consensus through shared experience rather than debate. The concept of willful ignorance was alien to them. What about the other 70%? The voice came through the building's speakers, though I'd learned it wasn't really David anymore. The persona was just a familiar interface the network used when communicating with me directly. 20% will accept new information immediately if it comes from trusted sources. The remaining 50% will adapt gradually, but only if the change seems beneficial and doesn't require them to abandon their existing social connections. And if the change requires abandoning existing social connections? I accessed the network's historical data, reviewing case studies from dozens of civilizations that had faced similar transitions. Then you get fragmentation. Families split apart, communities dissolve, Entire cultures disappear as people choose between old loyalties and new realities. The shadow beings had been hoping for a smoother integration process, something that would preserve human culture while upgrading our technological capabilities. But my analysis suggested that wasn't possible. The gap between human civilization and the galactic network was too vast to bridge without fundamental changes to how our species organized itself. "Show me the projections for full integration," I requested. The data flowed through my consciousness like ice water. According to the network's models, successful integration of human civilization would require the dissolution of existing nation-states, the elimination of economic systems based on scarcity, and the replacement of family structures with collective child-rearing protocols. Individual humans would retain their memories and personalities, but their social connections would be restructured around network objectives rather than personal relationships. In essence, everything that made human culture recognizable would disappear within a generation. "This is what happened to the others?" I asked. "The thousands of civilizations already in the network?" "Most of them, yes. Some species adapted more easily. They were already organized as collective consciousnesses before we made contact. But individualistic civilizations like yours always face the same choice: evolve or perish." I thought about my brother Danny in Seattle, my ex-wife Patricia, the handful of friends I'd managed to keep in touch with since leaving the army. Under the network's integration plan, those relationships would become irrelevant. We might retain affection for each other, but our actual social bonds would be replaced by connections to the collective consciousness. What about the people who refuse to integrate? They're allowed to live out their natural lifespans on reservation worlds, isolated planets where they can maintain their traditional social structures without interfering with network operations. Most die peacefully within a few generations, having never reproduced enough to sustain their cultures long term. Reservation worlds. The term made my stomach turn. Humanity's greatest minds, artists, and leaders reduced to museum exhibits on planets that served as cultural graveyards for species that couldn't adapt to galactic civilization. How many humans will choose the reservations? Based on our models of your species, approximately 60%. They'll resist integration until the environmental collapse becomes undeniable, then choose isolation over assimilation. The remaining 40% will join the network either voluntarily or through necessity. 40%. Out of 8 billion people, fewer than half would survive as part of the continuing human experience. The rest would become footnotes in galactic history, remembered only as another species that couldn't handle the transition to cosmic citizenship. I spent the next few days reviewing the specific protocols for Earth's integration. The shadow beings had refined their approach over millions of years, developing techniques that minimized violence while maximizing successful adaptation rates. Key infrastructure would be upgraded gradually, using technology that appeared to be human-developed, but actually relied on network principles. Economic systems would be stressed through carefully orchestrated resource shortages, making centralized distribution seem like a logical solution. Political leaders would be approached through intermediaries, humans like me who could explain the benefits of cooperation without revealing the full scope of the planned changes. It was manipulation on a planetary scale, but executed with surgical precision and genuine concern for minimizing human suffering. The process typically takes 15 to 20 years from first contact to full integration, David's voice explained during one of our sessions. We've accelerated the timeline for Earth because of the environmental crisis, but the basic approach remains the same. Gradual introduction of network concepts, followed by demonstration of their benefits, followed by widespread adoption as existing systems fail. And what happens to people like me during the transition? You'll serve as liaison officers, helping your species understand what's expected of them and identifying individuals who might be suitable for early integration. It's difficult work, but essential. Without human intermediaries, the resistance movement would be much stronger. Resistance movement. The network had identified several thousand humans who were likely to organize opposition to the integration process: military leaders, religious figures, politicians who derived their power from existing social structures. Most would be approached diplomatically first, offered positions in the new order that preserved some of their influence. Those who refused would be isolated through economic pressure or social manipulation, their ability to organize resistance systematically undermined. Has any species ever successfully resisted integration? A few, they're extinct now. Galactic civilization has little tolerance for aggressive neighbors, and any species advanced enough to threaten the network is advanced enough to destroy itself through warfare or environmental collapse. We prefer to intervene before that point. I understood the logic, but the implications were staggering. The shadow beings weren't offering humanity a choice. They were offering the illusion of choice. Join the network willingly, or be forced to join after your civilization collapsed from internal pressures they'd helped orchestrate. What about me specifically? What happens to Tommy Kowalski once the integration is complete? You'll continue to exist as an individual consciousness within the collective framework. Your memories, personality, and core decision-making processes will remain intact, but your priorities will evolve to align with network objectives, and your social connections will shift from personal relationships to collective responsibilities. So I'll still be me, but I won't want to be me anymore. You'll be a better version of yourself, more informed, more capable, more connected to the larger universe than any human has ever been. The loneliness and confusion that characterize individual existence will be replaced by the certainty and purpose that come from shared consciousness. I thought about the loneliness David had mentioned. Was that what I'd felt for most of my adult life? The sense that I was navigating existence without a clear purpose, forming temporary connections with other people who were equally lost. The network promised to eliminate that isolation, but at the cost of everything that made the struggle worthwhile. How long before the open contact phase begins? 2 years, 7 months. We're ahead of schedule thanks to the environmental acceleration and the success of early integration subjects like yourself. Once we have sufficient human liaisons in place, the formal announcement will be made simultaneously to every world government. Less than 3 years before humanity learned the truth. Before 8 billion people discovered that their species' independence was ending whether they wanted it or not. Some would welcome the news, grateful for salvation from environmental collapse. Others would fight with desperate fury against the loss of everything they'd ever known. And I would be standing in the middle, explaining to my own species why resistance was futile and integration was the only path to survival. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a burial shroud. I was no longer Tommy Kowalski, security guard from Arlington, Texas. I was something new, something between human and alien, tasked with shepherding my species through the most profound transformation in our history. Outside the Kellerman facility, Houston continued its daily routines, unaware that the countdown to the end of human civilization had already begun. The young woman's name was Rebecca Santos, and she'd driven down from Dallas because the Smithsonian had recommended her for a special archival project at the Kellerman facility. Film restoration expert, just like David had been. Security clearance just like David had possessed. The same obsessive attention to detail that made her perfect for the work ahead. She sat across from my desk in the lobby, reviewing the paperwork I'd given her. Standard forms, background verification, safety protocols. Nothing that would suggest she was about to become the next liaison in humanity's forced evolution. The previous restoration specialist left some equipment behind, I explained, watching her sign the documents with careful penmanship. We need someone to finish processing a few remaining film canisters. Mostly routine work, but some of the material is historically significant. Rebecca nodded, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. The administrator in DC mentioned Apollo-era footage. I've worked with similar materials before. How much are we talking about? Just one reel. 6 minutes and 14 seconds of lunar surface material. But it's been challenging to process properly. The previous specialist spent weeks trying to get usable results. Through the network, I could feel the shadow being's approval. Rebecca Santos fit their psychological profile perfectly. Intelligent, isolated, driven by curiosity that would override common sense when she encountered something truly extraordinary. In 72 hours, she would experience the same transformation I'd undergone, becoming another bridge between human culture and galactic civilization. "Where is the previous specialist now?" she asked. I gestured toward the East Wing. "David Martinez is still here, actually. He's transitioned to a consulting role with the project. You'll meet him once you get settled in." That wasn't entirely false. David's consciousness remained part of the network, accessible whenever the collective needed his expertise in human psychology or film restoration techniques. But the man who'd driven to the Kellerman facility that first night no longer existed as an independent entity. Rebecca gathered her paperwork and stood. "When can I start?" "Immediately, if you're ready. The equipment is already set up in room 7. I'll give you a tour of the facility, then you can begin reviewing the material." As we walked down the corridor, I felt a familiar pang of something that might have been guilt. Rebecca Santos would spend the next 3 days discovering the same truths that had destroyed my previous life. She would watch footage of humanity's first contact with an alien species, learn about the decades-long cover-up that followed, and eventually join the network that was orchestrating our species' transformation. By Friday, she would understand that human independence was an illusion that had already ended. "The work might seem routine at first," I continued, leading her toward room 7. "But stick with it. What you'll discover is going to change your perspective on humanity's place in the universe." Through the network, I could sense similar conversations happening in laboratories and research facilities around the world. Dr. Harrison Webb at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was reviewing satellite data that would lead him to the same conclusions. Professor Lisa Chen at MIT was analyzing radio signals that would connect her to the collective consciousness. Captain Marcus Riley at Peterson Space Force Base was investigating radar anomalies that would eventually make him another liaison officer. Hundreds of humans, carefully selected and systematically approached, each believing they were the first to discover the truth about the shadow beings. Each thinking they were making individual choices about humanity's future, unaware they were following a script written by entities that had guided similar transitions across thousands of worlds. Room 7 looked exactly as it had on my first night, down to the film canister labelled Apollo 11, camera malfunction, archive only. The scanner hummed quietly, ready to process impossible footage for another curious human who would learn too much to ever go back to normal life. "This is where you'll be working," I said, stepping aside to let Rebecca examine the equipment. "Take your time getting familiar with everything. The real discoveries always come to those who pay attention to the details others miss." She approached David's workstation with the same careful enthusiasm I remembered from our early conversations. In 3 days, she would be sitting in my chair, explaining the network's benefits to another carefully selected recruit. The cycle would continue until humanity was ready for the final revelation. Until 8 billion people learned that their species had already been adopted by a galactic civilization that brooked no resistance to its benevolent tyranny. I left Rebecca to her work and returned to the lobby, where my phone was already ringing with the next recruitment call.